The Ukrainian people have suffered through more than 900 days of war. The enormous casualties are reminiscent of dark times we never thought we would relive. And yet, once again, the world is at war, and more than 50 countries are involved. But Trump has made an important election promise. He will end the war in just 24 hours. So, if Trump is elected and then inaugurated on January 20 next year, Trump promises to strike a deal which ends the most violent conflict in Europe since World War II. That is, if you believe Trump's promise. So, can Trump end the Ukraine war? Let's take a closer look. All over the world, democratic elections are like a hailstorm of political messages. There is so much information, voters often get tired long before election day. And that's a shame, because it likely has a negative impact on voter turnout. The Pew Research Center has compiled a list of voter turnout in 50 significant democratic countries. Topping this list is Uruguay with an impressive voter turnout of 94.9%. We find the United States all the way down in 31st place on that list, with a less impressive turnout of just 62.8%, which is not a good sign for American democracy. But what does that have to do with Trump wanting to end the Ukraine war? Well, all kinds of factors play into low voter turnout, and one important factor is the level of disinformation. US politicians in particular spin it to win it. They get away with misrepresenting the facts and outright lying much more than we see in many other democracies. A key reason being the US has a more diverse and politicized media landscape, something which US politicians like Trump take advantage of. Just for comparison, the US has 21 nationwide news channels with varying degrees of political bias, and while they are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, the regulation is weak, as they write on their own website. The agency is prohibited by law from infringing on First Amendment rights of the press. In short, there is very little regulation. This is very different from a small country like Denmark, which has just 2 nationwide news channels, because these channels are by law operating under strict press ethics rules that require their news stories to be based on verified facts. This means if a Danish politician is outright lying on TV, he or she is almost guaranteed to meet a barrage of critical questions. And walking away from these questions is difficult, because politicians really depend on these 2 news channels to get their message out. But when Trump claims he can end the Ukraine war in just 24 hours, the situation is reversed. All the US news channels are competing for interviews with the same few key politicians, and if one channel asks uncomfortable questions, a politician like Trump can simply give interviews on a channel with a more convenient political bias. I believe that is very dangerous to democracy, because if American politicians refrain from appearing on news channels which would challenge their messages, how are voters ever going to hear the facts? And how are they supposed to vote? So, with the US elections coming up on November 5, I will be raising some of the questions which US politicians avoid, and I will investigate to find the facts. Beginning with the question for this episode: can Trump end the Ukraine war? The first time we heard Trump promise to end the Ukraine war was in January 2023 in a post on Truth Social, where he presented the noble motive of wanting to stop the tragic waste of human life. What may have started as an impulsive thought Trump has since turned into a stump speech with 3 key points. First, there would never have been a war in Ukraine had Trump still been president, because he was a deterrent to Vladimir Putin. And second, the war is expensive for US taxpayers. And third, if elected, Trump will end the war in just 24 hours. In this episode, we will examine each of these points to figure out if Trump is honest with the US voters. I believe his stump speech works quite well with his core audience because it's like a free lunch. There are no hard truths you have to accept. It's not about you having to work harder, pay more taxes, or cause less pollution. It's all about Trump being a strong man. And if you just vote for the strong man, he will fix it. To understand why this message is quite important for Trump's campaign, let us look at this graph which reveals the nature of political messages. The horizontal axis illustrates the substance of a message. So if a political message is both factual and really consequential for the voters, we will place the message all the way to the right, having a lot of substance. A good example of this would be when Trump talks about the cost of living in America, because it is an indisputable fact that inflation has been high throughout the Biden presidency. On the other hand, when Trump enters the climate debate by claiming that windmills kill all the birds, that's verifiably false. Yes, birds die from collisions with the windows in your home or collisions with cars, and of course some birds also die from collisions with windmills. But twisting that into saying that windmills kill all the birds takes all substance out of Trump's message. In fact, the US Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that house cats are 10,000 times more lethal to birds than land-based windmills. So this message belongs all the way to the left. The vertical axis illustrates the connotation of a political message, meaning how does the message make you feel? Messages which convey a positive feeling like self-confidence, hope or joy, we will move upwards on the graph, while Trump scaring people into thinking that all the birds will be killed belongs down here among the fear-mongering. When Kamala Harris uses her slogan, "When we fight, we win," the first thought that comes to mind is "you can win," which could place this message at the very top. But when hearing the message again, you realize it's conditional. When we fight, we win, which means you have to get off the couch and do something yourself in order to win. That is realistic, but perhaps not very substantive, because obviously Kamala Harris cannot promise the actual outcome of the election. And it is also an example of why Kamala Harris may find it more difficult than Trump to connect with voters who have few resources. If you work 2 jobs and still have a hard time paying your bills, hearing a politician demand more of you may be quite the turnoff for some voters, unlike the free lunch which Trump often serves. Therefore, the connotations of this message probably renders mixed feelings, and as an average, I will place this message vertically in the middle. I believe a prime weakness of Trump's campaign is too many of his messages are located in the lower left quadrant, which I call the oppressive messaging area. This is where you present false information to scare your own voters into thinking, I have to support this politician or my world falls apart. Trump does this a lot. For instance, on the day of the Trump assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, Trump was already stoking fear in the audience before the first shot was fired.
Because our country is going to hell, if you haven't noticed. Millions and millions of people are pouring in from prisons and from mental institutions.
If this message was really fact-based, where are the numbers? Not once has Trump presented any documentation to substantiate that people from prisons and mental institutions are a significant part of US immigration numbers. On that day, Trump was speaking in front of Pennsylvanians, of which around half are leaning towards Trump in the polls. So clearly, a lot of them believe what Trump is saying. But In Pennsylvania, 7.5% of the population are born in another country. That's 978,000 people, and 163,000 of those immigrants are from Europe. But where are the sources which document that European countries have emptied their psychiatric institutions? Obviously, that wouldn't be possible without someone finding out. Also, 93,000 of the immigrants are from India, but where is the documentation that many of them are mentally ill? What we do have are numbers from the American Immigration Council, which show that immigrants in Pennsylvania make up 12% of the workforce in the agricultural industry. They also make up 11% of their professional, scientific, and technical services industry. So, does anyone really believe these immigrants could fulfill these job requirements if they were millions of people from mental institutions? Obviously not. And even more importantly, with an unemployment rate of just 3.4% in Pennsylvania, would the Pennsylvanian economy benefit from deporting many of the immigrant workers, as Trump intends to do? Clearly, Trump's mental institution message has no substance, and this places his message all the way to the left, down here, because of the fear it conveys. Many of Trump's messages are like that, fictional and fear-based, because Trump has realized nurturing negative emotions works with the disillusioned and the angry voters. People who feel their life is a disappointment are often very glad to hear someone say that it's not their fault, but it's Biden's fault, or China's fault, or NATO's fault, or the transgender's fault, as Trump so often has claimed. Or in this case, it's the immigrants' fault. Trump not being truthful matters less to these voters because even a lie can feel comforting, as long as you do not question it. But his problem is, it's extremely hard to expand his voter base using fictional, negative messaging, and that is why promising to end the Ukraine war is so important. Because for Trump, this message has potential. It's factual. There is a war. And with the right decisions, the next president of the United States could influence when and how this war ends. Not only MAGA voters, but all types of voters instinctively think of war as a bad thing, and wanting to end the war is good. So Trump's message on Ukraine has positive connotations, which places it all the way up here. That is why this message gives Trump a chance to reach voters outside his MAGA audience. So let us examine Trump's stump speech on the war in greater detail. Trump's first claim is there would never have been a war had Trump been president because he was a deterrence to Vladimir Putin. But how can Trump know that? I believe Trump is right that before initiating a war of this magnitude, Putin must have analyzed how different world leaders would react to his full-scale invasion. So before the war, Putin must have thought about Trump's reaction if Trump had won the election in 2020 and was still in office when the invasion came. But knowing the secrecy with which Putin governs Russia, it's extremely unlikely Trump would know anything about Putin's conclusion. Only Putin knows if his analysis led him to believe that invading all of Ukraine while Trump was president was better or worse than invading with Biden in office. And there could be many other factors in his analysis, which led to the final invasion date in February of 2022, like the Russian economy, the progress of Russia's military preparations, Putin's relations with China, with the EU, etc. I find one of the possible factors particularly interesting. In theory, Putin could have planned to invade Ukraine during Trump's presidency and then gotten delayed by the COVID pandemic, which cancelled everyone's plans from the beginning of 2020. From this Russian news article, we know that it wasn't until the end of 2020 Putin could officially announce the first few vaccinations of critically important public employees. Throughout 2021, coronavirus was still very much a problem, But as time passed, Russia approved more vaccines, which helped get more people vaccinated. So if Putin did plan to invade in 2020 while Trump was in office, those plans would have been delayed. And he could very well end up invading Ukraine in 2022, just like he did. If that was what happened, the timing had nothing to do with Joe Biden not being much of a deterrent to Putin, as Trump implies, but everything to do with the pandemic. Moreover, there's a big blind spot in Trump's claim that Putin would not invade while Trump was in office, because Russia was already at war with Ukraine during all of Trump's presidency. Here is a timeline of the last 4 presidential terms. Putin invaded both Crimea in the south and the Donbas region in the east in 2014 during Barack Obama's second term. And Trump winning in 2016 did not make Putin end the war. On the contrary, Trump had very little focus on helping Ukraine free their country, which may even have encouraged Putin to proceed with the full-scale invasion. And bear in mind, war plans take a long time to develop, perhaps a year, if not more. So it is quite likely that Putin was contemplating a full-scale invasion during Trump's presidency, maybe even expecting Trump to win a second term in 2020, just like Trump expected it. And I'm not the only one believing Trump was no deterrence. CNN interviewed Trump's own national security advisor, John Bolton, and when asked if Trump deterred Putin from invading Ukraine, Bolton replied,
I personally, having watched Trump and Putin together on several occasions, having listened into their phone conversations, having myself met Putin on any number of occasions going back to October of 2001, I think that Putin essentially thinks that Trump is an easy mark. This is imagination on Trump's part.
So while Trump's message about being a deterrent to Putin may bring Republican voters a sense of pride, which is a positive connotation, we will place the message somewhat to the left, having little substance, in the area which I call the ignorant messaging area, where misinformation brings false hope. This brings us to Trump's second claim, that the Ukraine war is expensive for US taxpayers, as he explains it to Laura Ingraham on Fox News.
So what I would do is, first thing I get on the phone is with the European nations who are in for 25% of what we're in. We're in for over $200 billion. They're in for $35 billion.
We've spent about $100 billion so far, but it will be $160.
It's a difference of $150 billion. They've got to start paying up. You know, it affects them much more than it affects us.
Trump's core voters will likely believe this statement because Trump has spent years building the narrative that his voters are victims of the devious actions of other countries. If your family member died of COVID, they didn't die because of Trump's mishandling of the pandemic. According to Trump, they died because of the China virus, conveniently moving the blame away from him. And similarly, if your family is struggling financially, it's not because Trump has failed to improve on the inequality in America, but because other nations are ripping off the United States. But is it true that European nations have only invested 25% of what the US has invested in the war effort? Luckily, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy is tracking all donations to Ukraine, including military, financial, and humanitarian support from all allies. So let us compare the support from the US with the support from 2 other Ukraine allies, Germany and Denmark. I specifically chose Germany because they are a large, influential EU member, and Germany has been criticized for not supporting Ukraine enough, while Denmark has formidable Ukraine support. First, let us look at the direct donations from each country to Ukraine, the so-called bilateral donations. Here, the US has donated far more than Germany and Denmark, so at first glance it looks like Trump is right. But to get the full picture of the Ukraine support, it would be reasonable to factor in the expenses related to supporting Ukraine's wartime refugees. And while only very few refugees have fled to the US, more than 1 million Ukrainians have fled to Germany, meaning Germany's actual Ukraine support is significantly higher. Trump also conveniently forgets that while the US itself is a union of 50 states, both Germany and Denmark are members of the European Union. This means they do not only donate bilaterally, but also through the EU, again increasing their total donations. Of course, Trump is still right that all of the United States combined have donated more than individual states inside the EU. But that comparison does not make much sense, does it? It's like if the EU politicians said Florida had poor Ukraine support because combined, the 27 EU states have donated far more than Florida. What makes a much better comparison is looking at what each American, each German, and each Dane has actually donated to Ukraine. And doing the math, it turns out each American has spent $9 per month on the Ukraine war. That is less than what many Americans spend on one of their streaming subscriptions. Of course, for some families, those $9 matter in the budget, but it is a very small amount compared to other federal expenses. For instance, in 2023, the US spent $916 billion on its military, which means American citizens spent 11 times more on the military as a whole than they did supporting Ukraine. But as Germany and Denmark have smaller populations, their numbers are very different. Each German has spent $24 per month, so close to 3 times as much as the US citizens. And each Dane has spent $57 per month. That is 6 times what Americans spend. This is exactly why Trump shows up on Fox News, because he knows Laura Ingraham will not question his claims. He gets away with saying the US donates 4 times as much as other countries, which is technically correct if you cherry-pick the numbers, but also wildly misleading. And if we compare the combined donations from all of the United States to the combined donations from all of the EU is way ahead of the US, thanks in part to Trump and his Republican colleagues who have been doing everything they can to delay the aid to Ukraine. So when Trump claims the war is expensive because other countries are not paying their fair share, we will place that message on the left side as another fictional negative message. Finally, let's examine Trump's third claim that if elected, he will end the Ukraine war in just 24 hours, as he explains it here to Fox host Sean Hannity.
As you know, I get along very well with Putin. I would tell Putin, gotta settle. I would tell Zelensky, you gotta settle. I would tell one, you're gonna load up with money. I'd tell the other, you're not gonna get any money. I would get a settlement in 24 hours.
Many of Trump's core voters might believe this, because this is an intrinsic part of Trump's personal brand as the successful deal-maker. However, Ukraine is not just a piece of real estate which Trump can buy or sell as he sees fit. Ukraine is a UN-recognized sovereign nation with a pre-war population of 45 million people, bigger than any US state. And they are currently on track to becoming a member of the EU, with all the benefits that entails. Needless to say, it's the Ukrainian people who decide if they want to continue living in a free democracy or surrender to Putin's dictatorship. Forcing Ukraine to make any concessions to Putin would be as difficult as making any other large democratic country like Spain or Poland strike a deal with the Russian dictator. In Trump's imagination, He's a strong man who can easily coerce other nations into doing what he wants. But in real life, it just doesn't work that way. And Ukraine would be right not to accept any deal, because the reason there is a war is Putin wants to annex all of Ukraine to expand his Russian empire. That is his long-term goal. During the 24 years of his reign, Putin has been at war in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, and in the Central African Republic, and he has violated the territorial integrity of Moldova by keeping Russian forces in the breakaway region of Transnistria. Talk is cheap, and there is a reason Trump has not presented any specifics on his Ukrainian peace deal, because that would allow us to see why his deal would never work. But fortunately, we have someone deep inside the Republican leadership who has leaked some very important information about this deal. His name is J.D. Vance, Trump's candidate for vice president. He recently sat down for an interview with Navy SEAL veteran Sean Ryan, and much to my surprise revealed some astounding details. According to J.D. Vance, the deal will put an end to the war. He doesn't say much about the motive behind that, but obviously ending the war saves the US some money, which Trump can then use elsewhere in the budget. According to J.D. Vance, Putin gets to keep all of the territories he currently occupies, which is clearly something Putin can sell as a victory back in Moscow. The Europeans get to, and this is the wild part, pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Yes, in this election, Mexico is not going to pay for the wall, but the Europeans will pay to rebuild what Putin has destroyed. And Ukraine is told it can never join NATO, the EU, or any other international organizations Putin does not want Ukraine to join. Instead, 45 million Ukrainians just have to accept that everything Putin has stolen now belongs to Russia, including the homes of millions of Ukrainians who used to live in the occupied territories, and including all of the Ukrainian natural resources like lithium, oil and gas, which the occupied regions contain. So after Putin has obliterated hundreds of towns and large cities, after Putin's soldiers have raped Ukrainian women, even after thousands of Ukrainian children have been abducted to Russia and the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, he just gets to walk away victorious. That is Trump's plan. I can assure you there is no way the Ukrainians will ever accept that deal, and neither will Europe. Because everyone in Europe knows that if Putin wins, every resource he gains will be spent preparing for the next invasion into another European country. I do not want to get into history here, but in Europe we have seen how that works when mad dictators get ambitious. Of course, Republicans will say they are sure this is not Trump's plan, and J.D. Vance must have misunderstood Trump. But fortunately, we heard it from Trump himself in the recent presidential debate, where he kept avoiding the question, do you want Ukraine to win?
Just to clarify in the question, do you believe it's in the U.S. best interest for Ukraine to win this war, yes or no?
I think it's the U.S. best interest to get this war finished and just get it done.
All right.
That is not an answer from a leader ready to defend democracy against dictatorship. The promise to end the Ukraine war could have been an important message in Trump's political campaign, one which was both fact-based, positive, and had potential to attract more voters. But Trump knows very little about military conflicts, and apparently even less about how to end them. He claims he's a powerful deterrence to Vladimir Putin, but in reality, Putin was already at war with Ukraine during all of Trump's presidency. Trump also claims the Ukraine war is somehow ripping off US taxpayers. because other countries are holding back their aid. But in fact, as we have seen, it is the other way around. The US has now donated far less to Ukraine than the European Union, because Trump himself wanted his Republican Party to delay the aid to Ukraine. And on top of that, Trump imagines he can end the war in just 24 hours, when in reality, the Ukrainian people and Vladimir Putin have completely opposite goals. Knowing the catastrophic losses Russia has now suffered, Putin may be interested in ending the war before his country falls apart. But to survive and to stay in power, he needs an outcome which he can spin as a victory back in Moscow. And that is not something the Ukrainian people is willing to give him. According to a recent survey by the Razumkov Center, 84% of Ukrainians are against ceding any territory to Russia. So even if Trump is elected and he tells Ukraine to give up their land for peace, there is no way that would ever happen. And this is why Trump tries to hide his plans on Ukraine. From a survey by the Pew Research Center, we know that 75% of US voters are either concerned or very concerned about the prospect of Putin taking over Ukraine. Now imagine if Trump had begun his election campaign by saying, "Biden has failed in Ukraine, but I will defeat Vladimir Putin." That would have been a winning message with American voters, one which would resonate outside Trump's core MAGA minority. Russia is severely weakened, so if Trump claimed to be able to push Ukraine towards victory, that would have a lot of merit, which places such a message all the way to the right, on the substance axis. And most US voters would applaud him, finally ending the war with Ukraine winning and saving their democracy, placing such a message up here, in what I call the positive messaging area. But because we now know Trump's message is based on a plan which will never work, his message ends up over here in what I call the ignorant messaging area, presenting false hope based on a lie. Trump simply doesn't value defending democracy against dictatorship. To Trump, Ukraine is just another real estate deal, a loss-making hotel which Putin is willing to buy. To Trump, making Ukraine lose is a win. And Trump thinks he has a lot of leverage because, as president, he can stop the aid to Ukraine. But what happened the last time Trump tried that, during last winter? Ukraine was still backed by 49 countries, and they stepped up to save Ukraine. So even if ending the US aid allowed Putin's tanks to slowly push forward, the world could be facing years of war in Ukraine, paradoxically leading to more deaths and more destruction, the exact opposite of what Trump has promised. And this is why Trump spends his time on Fox News, where he can boast about having grand plans for Ukraine, without presenting a viable plan at all. Because at first glance, many of Trump's political messages sound promising, as long as Fox News hosts like Laura Ingraham are there to ensure no one asks any critical questions in front of the great misleader.